I'd like to start this lecture with a brief recap of our previous lecture. We looked at Peter Henry Emerson's book, Naturalistic Photography, and his theory that art should be true to nature, and being true to nature in terms of photography meant that photographs should approximate the look of the human eye. In so doing, he advocated for soft focus photography, either moving the camera lens slightly out of focus, or better yet, using a soft focus portrait lens. We also looked at the linked ring. The Brotherhood of the Linked Ring was a group of British photographers who promoted the art of photography. In America, we had similar movements. Alfred Stieglitz, arguably the most important voice in photography in the first half of the 20th century. He was a photographer, he was an editor, he was a curator. Rather than show you this video, it's about 6 minutes long. I've included the URL here, and I encourage you to watch this series from the Masters of Photography. Born in 1864 to Jewish German parents, his family immigrated from Germany and became wealthy from the garment business. Many of the family friends were artists. I include these portraits from a variety of people of Alfred Stieglitz. Stieglitz, not only an important photographer, but ran camera clubs, was an editor of various photographic journals, and ran galleries in the United States, some of the most avant-garde and important galleries of their time. For people who wanted to be something or do something in photography in this period of time, in a sense, they had to go through Alfred Stieglitz. He studied in Germany in 1881. He lived there until 1890. He began photographing in 1882 using a hand camera in the 1890s. He was idealistic. He was not interested in business. He liked intellectual pursuits and lived on an allowance. Essentially, he was an elitist. He looked toward Britain as the leaders in photographic thinking. He was influenced by Peter Henry Emerson's naturalistic photography, a belief that the artist's task was the imitation of the effects of nature on the eye. In Emerson's naturalistic photography, he believed that human vision was not uniform. The center of one's vision was the sharpest, and the marginal areas were more or less blurred. In that an artist must be true to nature, in Emerson's mind, the photographer must reproduce this by moving the camera slightly out of focus, or again, using soft focus lenses. He wrote, quote, "It must be understood that the so-called fuzziness must not be carried to the length of destroying the structure of any object. Otherwise it becomes noticeable, and by attracting the eye detracts from the harmony, and is just as harmful as excessive sharpness would be." End of quote. Stieglitz was also influenced and admired James McNeill Whistler and the paintings of Jean Millet. Stieglitz won international recognition. In 1887, he won first place in the exhibition in Britain, Amateur Photographer. The show was judged by Peter Henry Emerson, and he won first prize for this picture, which you see here, The Good Joke. In 1890, Stieglitz returned to America. Beaumont Newhall wrote, "When Stieglitz returned to America, he found amateur photography flourishing. There were many camera clubs and photographic societies, but none of them seemed to have the passionate belief in the art of photography which was spreading throughout Europe." Stieglitz wanted recognition and support for photography. He felt that a group of artists with shared convictions could be more effective than one. He joined the Society of Amateur Photographers of New York and helped them merge with New York's Camera Club to form a major group, the Camera Club of New York, in 1896. From 1893 to 1896, Stieglitz was the editor of American Amateur Photography magazine. He founded and edited the Camera Club's Camera Notes in 1897. He perfected the photogravure process, a relief image on a copper plate printed with printer's ink that combined the effectiveness of printmaking and photography. Photogravures gave the opportunity to have high-quality reproductions of a photographer's work in print. In his book, American Photography, 1945 to the Present, Jonathan Green wrote, "With an American bravado, he prided himself on being the first to accomplish new technical feats, to photograph under difficult conditions of rain, snow, and night, for example. He was the first to use the hand camera to describe in a lucid, direct manner the vitality of the New York street scene." You see that in a few of these photographs. Some Camera Club members became alienated from Stieglitz's idea of photography as a suggestive rather than a purely descriptive medium. They argued the effectiveness of straight photography versus manipulation. Stieglitz used the soft focus lens to emulate humans' vision, according to Emerson's theory. Stieglitz left the Camera Club. In 1902, he founded the Photo Secession, a group of photographers whose aim was to advance photography as art through exhibitions and publishing. Some of the original members included Frank Eugene, Gertrude Kasebier, Joseph Kiley, Edward Steichen, Clarence White, and others. They promoted the pictorial style of art, that of naturalistic photography. They founded Camera Work magazine. Camera Work became the journal of contemporary photography during its day. It was highly influential. Stieglitz served as its editor from 1903 to 1917, picking the works that graced the pages of the magazine. Camera Work was called, quote, "the most radical American magazine of arts and letters," end of quote. And it included photographers Stieglitz felt were important. In 1905, the Photo Secession opened the little galleries of the Photo Secession, later called 291 Gallery. It was at 291 Fifth Avenue. Of Stieglitz's artwork, Jonathan Green wrote, "His genius was to fuse the European heritage with America's indigenous frontier spirit." I might point out the title in this piece that you see here, "The Hand of Man." Certainly a traditional photographic title at the time would be more purely descriptive. Might say Train and Train Tracks or New York City, but titling it "The Hand of Man" spoke to the fact that a photograph, like paintings or other kinds of art, could serve as a metaphor. In essence, photographs could be about things rather than simply of things. Again, Jonathan Green writes, "From Europe, Stieglitz brought a sense of history and an insistence that present concepts be tested by the traditions of the past. From Europe, he inherited a set of exacting, unimpeachable standards of excellence and sophistication." Stieglitz's work was influenced by academic painting. Displaying evidence of these traditions were among the reasons for his acceptance and its acceptance as art. I might point out parts of this composition which are somewhat radical for their time. Notice that we have a central focal point, the woman on the street here, but we have a number of counterpoints to that, as you see with not only the other people, but look at how he uses the edge as well. There's a tension here along the edge of the photograph. And as the lines lead us back into the photograph, notice too this prominent X on the side there, again, X, two opposing lines, creates a certain kind of visual tension. It's a way to get us to move our eye around the frame to look at all parts of the picture rather than simply a centralized focal point. The soft focus work has at times the look and feel of Impressionist paintings. As Aaron Scharf suggests in his book, Art and Photography, the slow emulsions and slow shutter speeds and several of the Impressionists' knowledge of their use of photography may have had an influence on those paintings. The steerage is one of Stieglitz's most famous pieces. Look at the form in this picture. In the center of the picture, we have a plank or a walkway that serves as a divider from the top half and the bottom half of the picture. Notice what we can see in the top half. We have people in fine clothes and hats and all. In the bottom, we have people in perhaps more shabbily dressed. You can also see they're hanging their laundry to dry and other kinds of things. The steerage is a term that we don't use much today, but the steerage references the difference in social class. The steerage refers to the everyday class, to the common people. In essence, the form, the division here from top and bottom, what this photograph is about, in my interpretation, is class differences. You see the more affluent people in their more affluent dress on the top, and the less affluent in their less affluent dress and way of life on the bottom. Again, the picture's descriptive, but it's also a metaphor. Jonathan Green's words, quote, "This seminal mixture of the old world and the new is wonderfully evident in the role Stieglitz took up as high priest, educator, and prophet of photography and modernism. Surrounding himself with artists, intellectuals, and disciples, he took the character of the old world master, peppering traditional teachings with parables and similes. Yet he was also the American frontier preacher and humorist, fiercely individualistic, irreverent, at times homespun, colloquial." End of quote. Stieglitz's work and career represent the synthesis of the older European cultural concerns with a new frontier and a new explorative spirit. In the process, Stieglitz legitimized photography as a means of conscious artistic expression. Again, Jonathan Green's words. In his gallery, Stieglitz began showing avant-garde art. He showed many artists in the United States for the first time. You can see American artist Martin Hartley. Again, that was a Stieglitz portrait of Hartley, as you see here in one of his paintings. Another American artist that Stieglitz showed was Arthur Dove. But he also showed European artists for the first time in this country. Many of these names are household names to any art historian. They include Rodin, Matisse, Cezanne, Picasso, Brancusi, and Braque. He showed Rodin and Matisse and Picasso as early as 1908. Here you see examples of some of the works by those artists. His gallery showed avant-garde art and educated American audiences to many of these European artists. He exhibited the work of George O'Keeffe in 1916. He met her in 1917 when she came to his gallery to look at the show of Marston Hartley. For 24 years, his junior, O'Keeffe, married Stieglitz in 1924. Here's one of O'Keeffe's pieces. Stieglitz worked on a portrait of O'Keeffe from 1917 to 1937 when he stopped photographing. He believed that a true portrait would follow a person through time from birth to death and should show many facets and moods of an individual. Here you see that in this series, Over Time, of George O'Keeffe. In 1917, Stieglitz ended Camera Work magazine. The last issue was devoted to Paul Strand and the return of straight photography and modernism. Paul Strand will be one of the subjects of our next lecture. Stieglitz did less photography during his years curating works for the 291 Gallery. In 1917, he left New York City for Lake George in upstate New York. This piece, Spiritual America, again a metaphorical title, and it displays his interest in the metaphor. Descriptively, this picture is on the back half of a horse, but there's enough clues here. You can see the harness that the horse is wearing suggests this is a workhorse. It's not a horse out to pasture. It is one that is working with humans, whether it's pulling a cart or a plow, I'm not so sure. But the title, Spiritual America, my interpretation of that title in relation to this piece, it's a working horse. It's a working class horse. He's perhaps suggesting that the spirit of America, the spiritual America, is based on hard work. Again, a metaphor rather than pure description. That leads us into another significant group of his photographs entitled The Equivalence. The Equivalents were originally titled Songs of the Sky, and you can see that he worked on this series for about 10 years. Songs of the Skies are metaphor. They're pictures of clouds, but largely what they're about is human emotion. The title Songs of the Sky, and later retitled The Equivalence, makes that suggestion. Looking at the equivalents, a viewer might ask, well, what are they equivalent to? In Stieglitz's view, these were equivalent to pieces of classical music. The different kinds of moods and emotions that could be elicited from that music could be elicited from photographs as well. Sometimes the photographs and the mood is somber or foreboding or dramatic, like you see in this picture or in this. Other times it could be more airy and sweeping, perhaps more lighthearted. By titling them The Equivalents, Stieglitz is pronouncing his view that photographs, like other works of art, are metaphors. They're not pure scientific description of their subject matter, but again, they can be about things above and beyond what they depict. The equivalents are analogies. They're also strikingly beautiful. Stieglitz returned to New York City. He did a whole series of photographs out his window. He ran an American Place, a gallery from 1929 to his death in 1946. You can see some cross-influence between George O'Keeffe and Stieglitz. They influenced each other. At this point, he had abandoned the soft focus imagery of his earlier days. These works fall more in line with a modernist approach to photography. We'll talk more about modernism in our next lecture. Picture in the background here by photographer Ansel Adams, another photographer we'll look at a little later in the semester, of Stieglitz sitting in his gallery. And one of the cards from the gallery here gives you an idea of Stieglitz's mindset. No formal press views, no cocktail parties, no special invitations, no advertising, no institution, no isms, no theories, no game being played, nothing asked of anyone who comes, no anything on the walls except what you see there. The doors of an American place are ever open to all. Another Ansel Adams photograph of Stieglitz in an American place. Another photograph of Stieglitz by Weegee, another photographer we'll look at later in the semester when we talk about photojournalism. Stieglitz died in 1946. He spent his life as a champion of photography, working with others to get photography accepted as a legitimate form of art. He gave voice to other photographers as both the editor of camera notes and camera work. He showed photography along with other arts in his galleries. He was avant-garde during his time and ushered in a new era for photography's acceptance. Edward Steichen was born in 1879. He started photographing in 1895. He had his first exhibition in 1899 at the Photographic Salon in Philadelphia. In 1900, he moved to Paris. That same year, he met Alfred Stieglitz. Stieglitz bought 3 of his photographs. He went to Europe to study painting, but only did that for a few weeks. Instead began to photograph European, American, and intellectual artists and literary personalities. He became a quick success. This early piece, The Pond, Moonrise, which is a hand-colored platinum print. You can see some of the coloration in the sky and in the reflection. Just as a side note, this piece in 2006 sold for $2.9 million. At the time, it was the highest amount paid for a single photograph. Since that time, there have been several other photographs to sell for even more. Steichen was an original member of the Photo Secession and largely worked as a partner in the early days with Alfred Stieglitz. His portraits of known European and American personalities are included here. You can see this one from F. Holland, which was published in Stieglitz's Camera Work magazine. George Frederick Watts. This great portrait of John Pierpont Morgan. Look at not only the look on Morgan's face, but look at this gesture, the hand. It almost looks like he's holding a dagger. He's not. He's sitting in a chair. The chair had a metal arm which curves and bends here and it's reflecting the light. But the intensity of this photograph, the intensity on his face and the intensity of that look of the dagger gives you some idea of the sense of personality, the ruthlessness of this financier. The writer George Bernard Shaw. This artist Rodin with his sculpture, The Thinker. Steichen put the 291 gallery in touch with Rodin and Matisse while he was in Paris. He helped organize an exhibition of the Photo Secession at the Albright Art Gallery in 1910. It was the first major museum honoring photography in the United States. During World War I, he returned to the United States. He gave up painting after seeing Paul Strand's work in the last issue of Camera Work in 1917 and renounced his earlier soft focus work and began to make straight photographs. He made some of the first modern fashion photography as early as 1911. He returned to America for good in 1923 to photograph for Condé Nast publication Vogue and Vanity Fair. He became one of the best known and admired portrait photographers in this country. He also became the highest paid commercial photographer of his time. You can see some of his works for those publications. His work was included in 2 exhibitions at the Museum of Modern Art in the 1930s. He curated the Road to Victory for the Museum of Modern Art in 1942. During World War II, he became the chief of naval combat photography. In 1945, he won an Academy Award for the Best Documentary Film for his film, The Fighting Lady. He was hired by the Museum of Modern Art as their photo department director and served there from 1947 to 1961. During that time, in 1955, he curated the very popular exhibition, The Family of Man. This was seen by over 9 million people in 69 different countries as it traveled the world. It sold 2.5 million books. Today, a good run on a contemporary photography book is about 2,000. He sold 2.5 million books. The Family of Man was an extremely popular exhibition, but it was somewhat controversial in photography. While it was a popular success, sort of showing pictures made from people all over the world, showing the positive sides of humanity, happy families as they gathered together, as you can kind of see in the illustration from this copy of the book. Not all photographers were thrilled with the exhibition. Robert Frank, whose work we'll look at later in the semester in a later lecture, was quoted to have said that this just set photography back 10 years. Steichen hired John Sarkowski in 1962 to replace him as the director of the photo department at the Museum of Modern Art. Sarkowski is someone who we'll also look at a little later in a later lecture, and he became a domineering voice in photography in the latter half of the 20th century. Gertrude Kasebier was born in 1852 in Des Moines, Iowa. She moved to Brooklyn in 1864 upon the death of her father. In 1889, she began studying art at the newly formed Pratt Institute in New York. A few years later, in 1894, she studied photographic chemistry in Germany. A year later, she moved back to New York and began as an assistant in a photographic portrait studio. A year later, in 1896, she exhibited at the Boston Camera Club, and in 1897, an exhibit at Pratt Institute. She earned her living as a portrait photographer, opening a studio in 1897. That next year, she saw Buffalo Bill's Wild West show and sought permission to make portraits of the Native Americans. She had a long relationship with members of the Sioux and made many portraits. In 1899, Alfred Stieglitz published her work in Camera Notes and wrote about her work, quote, "Beyond dispute, the leading artistic portrait photographer of the day." Her work is characterized by metaphors. "Blessed art thou among women" alludes to Madonna and child, or mother and daughter. Her photograph, The Manger, sold for $100, the highest price for a photograph at that time. In 1900, she was elected a member of the Linked Ring, one of only 2 women in that prestigious London-based group. In 1902, she became a founding member of Alfred Stieglitz's Photo Secession. 6 of her images were included in the very first edition of Camera Work magazine by the Photo Secession. In 1916, along with Photo Secession member Clarence White, she set up a group called the Pictorial Photographers of America, as the two, among others, began to be troubled by Stieglitz, who eventually disbanded the group just a year later. Kasebier championed the work of other photographers, and particularly of other women photographers. Two of note are Laura Gilpin and Imogen Cunningham. Clarence White was an amateur painter, architect, designer, and musician. He admired the work of painter James Whistler. He was an original member of the Photo Secession and began photographing around 1893. Essentially, his work portrays the peaceful life of the family. He was a self-taught photographer and worked in the pictorialist style. He moved his family to New York in 1906 to be closer to Stieglitz and Stieglitz's group of friends, and was an active part of the Photo Secession. He taught photography workshops at Columbia University as early as 1907. By 1914, he set up the Clarence White School of Photography, the first educational institution in America to teach photography as a fine art. In 1925, White died of a heart attack while teaching in Mexico City. Annie Brigman was born in Hawaii. She was 16 when her family moved to Los Gatos, California. Her most famous photographs were taken between 1900 and 1920. They generally depict nudes in dramatically posed, primordial locations, often in natural settings. She would extensively touch up her negatives with paints, pencil, and sometimes superimposed her images. Her works deliberately suggest bohemianism. Her work challenged the established cultural norms and defied convention, instead often embracing paganism. She was close friends with writer Jack London, among others. In 1902, she came across a copy of Camera Work magazine. She wrote Alfred Stieglitz and praised him for his journal and his work. Stieglitz, in turn, appreciated Brigman's work as well. In 1902, he listed her as an official member of the Photo Secession. She was the only photographer west of the Mississippi to be so honored. Most of her photographs were shot in the Sierra Nevada mountains. They are elaborately staged and posed. She became a revered West Coast photographer and influenced many other contemporaries. Fred Holland was a noted photographer and publisher. He was an early advocate in the United States of photography being considered a fine art. Day was the son of a Boston merchant and was a man of independent means. He was first trained as a painter. He began photography around 1880. Day co-founded and self-financed the publishing firm of Copeland and Day, which from 1893 through 1899 published nearly 100 titles. These included works by Oscar Wilde, Aubrey Beardsley, and Stephen Crane. At the turn of the century, F. Holland Day's influence and reputation as a photographer rivaled that of Alfred Stieglitz, who later eclipsed him. The high point of Day's photographic career was his organization of an exhibition of photographs held at the Royal Photographic Society in 1900. It included works by Alvin Langdon Coburn, as well as 103 photographs by Day himself. Titled The New School of American Photography, it included 375 photographs by 42 pictorial photographers. It evoked both high praise and scorn from critics. The popularist Photographic News saw his work as a result, quote, of a diseased imagination of which much has been fostered by the ravings of a few lunatics, unacademic and eccentric. However, fearing competition as a photographer and promoter and tastemaker, Stieglitz refused to participate in this exhibition and used his influence to block the exhibition in the galleries of the Linked Ring. It was held at the Royal Photographic Society instead. Day's works tended towards theatricality as well as sexuality. Some scrutinized his close relationship with men, but largely hid his sexuality according to the standards of the day. Stieglitz and the Photo Secession championed pictorial photography and its acceptance as art. As innovative photographer and editor of the most important art journals of the day, Camera Notes and Camera Work, and curator of many important groundbreaking exhibitions of both European and American artists, Stieglitz and his group and followers were some of the most important voices in American art in the first half of the 20th century.